We're going to start by justifying why you're spending this time with me and your peers, and I think I can illustrate that through a tale of two forms. You can see on your screen two items. They're analogous. One is a photocopy from a paper form, and one on the right is a digital electronic version of that same form. Just looking at them, one is sharper and clear, but there's lots of other little attributes of the paper form that are really poor practice. I understand that there's codes behind labels, that 1 and 2, but there's certainly no reason for the CRC to see what those codes are, at least not during the form filling process. Whoever created this form used 1 for the no value and 2 for yes in this checkbox, but elsewhere in the study, flip that code list. The illustration is hand-drawn. It would not scale if this was blown up. So a lot of problems here. Compared to the one on the right, we have clear yes or no options. The code value is being saved behind the scenes. And we have 2 vector format graphics that would scale up if someone increased their screen size. So a lot cleaner, more intelligible experience. Let's look at another one. There we're comparing two electronic forms. On the left, we have somewhat of a crowded form. We have a table format where the first item for fat shows 5 items. The next item for lobular inflammation shows a different 4 items, so there's an inconsistency there. I understand they're measuring along 2 different dimensions, but to the eye it's very confusing. And if you look at the fat item between A and B, you'll notice the scales are different. The scale in A starts with 0 fat. The scale in section B starts with less than 5%. That's going to open up a whole can of worms when it comes to analysis. The version on the right, we have a much cleaner, more compact format of the same data. You can see that for the histology section and for the NAS section, the scale for the fat item is the same, as it should be, for measuring the same thing. You can see that in the table that's presented during the histology section. It's cleaner. We're collecting the same information, but our labels of none, mild to few, moderate, marked to many just appear once at the top of the field. There aren't so many items that those labels are going to get lost. Well, what does this mean, these two forms? Well, think back to the ones on the right and the ones on the left. The ones on the right were, I hope, more of a joy to work with, so coordinators aren't going to avoid them. They're not going to hold on to paper records for longer than they have to, so the time to entry is shorter. Because we have the proper item types and we have clarifying visuals, the data is cleaner from the start. Because we'll have smart edit checks, fewer queries will be raised. In the end, the database will lock quicker and cleaner with fewer or no missing data. Now think back to the paper forms or the hastily put together eCRFs. The forms were confusing and unwieldy, meaning your CRCs are going to postpone their data entry. It's something they'll save for when they can tolerate the frustration of filling them out. Participants will avoid your forms altogether. They are not obliged to fill out your forms. You've asked them, they've agreed, but participants are the VIPs of this study. They don't deserve any hurdles when filling out ePRO. Unhelpful or absent edit checks will let a lot of dirt in. Your database lock will be delayed, and missing and/or invalid data will undermine your results or your submission. All right, we've got about 8 minutes left. Looks like I'm going to end right on time. Principle 6 is know your audience. This is more sort of psychological profiling. Am I dealing with a CRC or a participant? And in this section, we're going to put some of the best practices from the last 15 minutes to use. But first, I want to give you a profile of the site user and the participant, 2 of our most common user types. Though not only, I should say before we dive too deep in here that you have to keep the investigator in mind. You have to keep the statistician in mind. You have to keep yourself in mind. You're going to be looking at these forms more than anyone. But when it comes to getting clean data from the start, really that's the site user, typically the CRC, and the participant. What do we know about site users? Well, they're excellent multitaskers. They are experienced with massive data collection. They've signed on to the study's SOPs. including the language of communication. You're not obliged to write your form in every language if it's a multinational study, though it's never a bad idea, and I'll show you in a minute how you can do that. And site users generally want to advance research, so they're very hardworking. So my best friends are CRCs. So that's the good news when we're designing forms, that we have a really receptive audience who wants to succeed and wants the study to succeed. Looking at the participant, they're involved in just your study, typically. Most of the time they could only be in your study, so that's a boon, that you're not competing for their attention with other forms and other studies. They do have a vested interest in compliance. This is a lot of times their health that's on the line, so they don't want to skip visits, and they don't want to skip diary entries. They're grateful for the chance to participate, so they're going to do everything they can to make your job easier. And like the CRCs, they genuinely want to advance their research. That's the good news. But there's some warnings to keep in mind as well. For the site user, your study competes with other studies in their clinical work. My prior job was in a clinical trial optimization system. I've spoke to hundreds of CRCs, and each one of them has a favorite study. And not only is it based on the therapeutic area or the patients, something maybe they studied in grad school, it has to do with the EDC. If they hate the forms, they hate the study. Your EDC may be their most preferred, but it may be their least. Remember, the site user reports to the PI, not to you, so that if you have a rule for every piece of data has to get into the system within 3 days of collection, and the queries have to be answered within 5 days, the 3-5 rule, please know that that is merely a suggestion from the CRC's point of view, however much it might be gospel to you. Also keep in mind that for the participants, your form competes with their life. So they really shouldn't have to put up with a messy or complicated form. They don't have to report. Their participation is, of course, voluntary to begin with, and they can discontinue at any time. Remembering to complete your form is a courtesy, not an obligation, so you may want to think about a friendly reminder mechanism. And they may abandon your form at the first hint of an obstacle, and in fact, they be justified in. And they are under no obligation to know the language of your form. So if you are conducting an international study with an ePRO component, I would strongly advise translating your forms and having them each available to the participants. So what does the good and the bad mean for our forms? Well, for the site user, we have to make data entry efficient. We have to make sure that it renders legibly and functions as intended on all common browsers for laptops and screens. Why is this important? Why can't we just have a nice looking e-form that works on a desktop? Well, you want to be on the vanguard, as we are, in pushing for eSource. If we can have the first place of entry be your form, that's one less source doc verification your monitors have to do. I long for the day, as many of you, as I assume, do, where the coordinator is bringing their laptop, their tablet into the exam room. You want edit checks that drive speed and accuracy. And you always want to ask yourself, could my eCRF rendered on a tablet replace paper source and transcription? Until that answer is yes, keep working on the form. For the participant, you want to make data entry a pleasure. Your form should render legibly and function as intended on any device. An older population may not be on a smartphone, but more and more younger generations are, and they are not going to put up with having to fill out a paper form. They want to give you their data on their device. Your form must make it impossible to submit invalid data. Remember, queries aren't an option with ePRO forms. And for international trials, your form should accommodate participant language preferences. So let's take a look at an actual form here. Give me a moment while I get over to our system. Okay, the first thing you'll notice once we load here is that it seems like I only have one question so far, but you're going to see that I'm going to use branching logic to only show the future fields once I have a date of assessment, because this date of assessment is critical to me. Later down the line, I have to know how many days have passed since the first assessment. So I want to force the coordinator to enter a date here. Let's say it's today. All right. Now that I've entered a date, the rest of my form appears along with some instructions. Collect demographic data first, then measure and record weight and height, measure and record vitals last. So let's put in my I'm going to date myself here. I'm an old man. All right. No, not Hispanic. Okay, so I'm using the proper items for, this is a radio button. It's one or the other, not both and not neither. This could be a mix of races. If I have other, it prompts the additional race field. Height and weight units, again, we can imagine this is being conducted in Europe and in North America, where both the metric units and standard units would both be common. So I'm going to, because I'm here in the US, I'm going to use pounds and inches. You notice that if I put kilograms and centimeters, it might be hard to see on your screen, but my item hints have changed from nearest whole kilogram and nearest whole centimeter with pounds and inches, nearest whole pound, nearest whole inch. Okay, here I'm going to lie. Let's say that I am 187 and I am 72 inches. Okay. Now, if I put something like 27, I'm going to get a range check. Expected range for height is between 48 and 76 inches. Saved values outside of this range will generate an auto query. All right, so I know what to expect as a CRC if I continue this form. An auto query is going to be raised, and I'm going to have to come back and explain why this participant is 2 feet 3 inches tall, or I'm going to have to change it. Let's change it right now. All right. Let's put in, again, we'll do the same thing with temperature. Let's have some pretty non-controversial values here. All right, it says I must take at least one blood pressure measurement, and if time allows, I'm going to take additional measurements lying down or standing. Let's say my blood pressure is about where it should be for systolic and diastolic. And now notice that if the CRC was able to take additional measurements for more precision, all they would have to do is hit supine, and they'd be prompted for the input fields for lying down or standing. So I can have one or neither. And only then, with the base information, can I proceed to the next field. Now, instead of a very ugly table with the label values repeated over and over again, I have a nice clean instructions. Read one question at a time, repeating the response options after each one. You may repeat the questions if asked, but do not elaborate on the wording or suggest a response. So proper OBS row, or observation reported outcomes, we're not going to lead the participant, of course. We're going to make it clear and then have them give up their unvarnished answer. So you can imagine the answer to these questions. All right. Only when I have a input for all the fields will the form allow me to proceed. So I'm sort of enforcing a workflow here. Okay, now here's an example of the form doing some work. I'm going to read what it says here in case it's a bit small on your screen. Today, we measured your weight as 85 kilograms or 187 pounds. In general, the healthy weight range for a 43-year-old male, which the form calculated based on my date of birth, for your height is between 62 kilograms or 137 pounds on the low end and 84 kilograms or 185 pounds on the high end. This range does not take into account many factors unique to you, and your weight is only one part of your overall health. That said, safely losing weight may improve your health. So this tells the participant, this tells the CRC, if reporting this information is part of the intervention, exactly what to say. They don't have to get out a BMI calculator. It's a simple equation, but my form did it for me. It took into account the recorded height down to the inch, and it deduced what a healthy weight would be. And by the way, this is just the BMI. I'm not advocating for or against it, just using it as an example. And then ask me, has the participant been debriefed, yes or no? And at this point, I can complete the form. It's going to ask me, once again, always good practice to make sure the marking it as complete was intended. And I'm going to confirm it. So we saw a lot of good practices in there. And I know I'm going over a bit over here, but hopefully everyone seems to have stuck around. So thank you. I'll try to wrap it up in the next 5 minutes or so. Let's imagine that same form, or at least components of it, being given directly to a participant in an ePRO form. You're going to notice that the pace here is a little bit more leisurely. We're not going to have tables. We're not going to have grids of information. We don't want the participant feeling like they're sitting in a waiting room. That's okay. Some of that density is okay for a CRC. As we know, they're good multitaskers. They're used to medical forms. But with participants, we really want to take it one step at a time. This should be as pleasant as a conversation between a really compassionate physician and the participant. As you can see in this welcome screen, it says, hello, we would like to ask some questions about your eating habits. You can expect to complete the short questionnaire in 2 to 3 minutes. Click next to continue. I've set some expectations. I've let the participant know I won't be taking too much of their time. And you can see that I've given them the option to have this form render in the default language of English or in Spanish or French. In this case, let's imagine that the participant is a French speaker, and the first item from the, we're not going to bother them with weight and height. We're going to assume those were in-clinic measures. We're going to take the truly obs-ro portion of that previous form and make it ePRO. We're asking them, I forgot my French here, but this is translated. And we have a ordinal scale between mostly disagree, somewhat disagree, actually on a mostly false, somewhat false, neither true nor false, mostly true, and I prefer not to answer. We've asked if they prefer not to answer. That way we know the participant hasn't skipped the form. Ideally, we would like an answer other than this, but we'd rather get something to acknowledge that the participant did view and interact with this item. Notice I'm only asking one question here. I'm not presenting it as a table. Why? Well, if my forms render on smartphone, and they should, we don't want to have a big cumbersome form or a big cumbersome table. That's not going to present well. It's going to be scaled down. The last thing we want is the participant having to use the tab of the tip of their finger to scroll across. We just want to have that finger used for next. One at a time, one at a time. And finally, we're using images as selectors. Those images should be able to scale down without losing any resolution. In this case, I've just defaulted to English, and you can imagine a different participant. Click the picture of the food that is more appetizing to you right now. So again, with the site user, we can use the form to follow or enforce a clinical workflow when ordering items. We really want to climb inside their head and make this sure that our form is a partner to them and not a taskmaster. We're never going to assume units of measure unless your protocol demands that they only be collected in one unit of measure. We're going to use tables and grids for input fields. Why? Well, we don't want to have a new page load and slow things down. If a table is going to be filled out hundreds of times by the CRC, they will appreciate a clean and compact table any day. We have to lose the paper mindset where responsive fields and a cleaner layout will boost efficiency. And this is almost always. You can't have skip logic on paper. Paper isn't real time. But we want to make sure that if something isn't required or something doesn't need to be asked, that we don't ask it. And we use our skip logic for doing that. And of course, there's nothing wrong with mimicking paper forms where those are very familiar. I put lose the paper mindset first because I think that's more important. But if you know the CRCs are comfortable with a paper form, then do your best to actually make a facsimile of that in electronic format. For the participant, remember the culture. Some questions that may seem innocuous and medical to you may be inappropriate in certain cultures. Try to have in place a mechanism for just-in-time reminder text. It's one thing to say at the outset, please enter your dietary information every night at 6 p.m. That's going to get forgotten. You do ideally want a system where the participant is going to get a text message or an email at that time every day, politely asking them to enter more information into their nutritional diary. You want to discourage skips or the participant overlooking a field by offering a prefer not to answer choice. If prefer not to answer is selected, you could use branching logic or skip logic to ask a follow-up question that's maybe a little less personal, so you still get some data. And remember that a lot of ePRO forms are licensed licensed instruments like quality of life. You do have to pay for them, or you're going to be running afoul of some pretty strict laws, and you cannot really modify them. If they've been built up and validated on paper, That doesn't mean they can't be served electronically, but they have to meet certain equivalency tests, meaning that they're comprehended the same way, and you may have to check whether your eCRF version meets that equivalency standard by checking with the board. In the case of the EQ5LD, that would be a Euroqual.